mixing it all up.
You don't have a story plan, do you?
A story? A story planned? Why would I do that?
I don't know.
Why would I have a story plan? Actually, I really don't. But what I did hear about is a guy who ripped off Uber Eats. Did you hear about this?
This means you have a story plan. Like, I don't know what you mean by you don't have one planned.
So there's a guy who ripped off Uber Eats by signing up for it. Okay, maybe I shouldn't describe the scam to its completion, but all you kind of need to know is that he had a credit card that's given to you by Uber Eats that you use to pay for
the food.
Right,
okay.
on like a customer's behalf, which I think is nuts, first
That is
of all.
kind of weird, yeah.
So basically he would get the credit card unlocked to pay for people's food, and then he would just go buy a bunch of gift cards. And then I guess, sell the gift cards. But he did it for like millions of dollars.
Really?
Like I'm like, how do you get away with this for that long? I have no idea.
I always think about when I hear like kind of, because that's a large scale amount of thievery,
right,
and theft.
Yeah.
But what I think about is like, wouldn't you just stop? Like, don't you think at a certain point you're like, if I stopped right now,
yeah,
I'd get away with this,
and like nobody would catch,
and no one would.
Well,
and you're probably like already so far ahead financially than where you were previously.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I bet. Well, so I'm pretty sure he hasn't gotten caught yet. Like, I think he's still.
Wait, so what is this, a Reddit post?
Yeah, it was on Reddit. Yeah, so who knows if it's true? But
okay.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy.
Is this some guy's screenplay that he's just testing
maybe,
the waters?
Yeah, he's like, ooh, what do you think? But he was like stealing from the rich, right? Which is seems okay, I guess.
I still think it's weird.
Yeah, who else steals from the rich though? Robin Hood.
And
you know what game Robin Hood is in? Lately?
Yeah. What?
Lorcana.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Lorcana.
Let's do it.
Wow. Distraction makers.
So as far as I can tell, Lorcana is run by Uber.
Yeah,
right.
Right.
That's how it's connected.
That
right?
was the connection.
I thought so. Okay.
Anyway, okay. First, let's talk about the craziness around Lorcana, which is also someone stealing from the rich, I suppose. But so Pixelborn is a program that someone randomly made that lets you play Lorcana. You have access to all the cards. You play it like Hearthstone.
Yep.
I don't feel bad talking about it because everybody's talking about it.
A lot of people know about it. It's just kind of there.
It's great. Okay, so this is a short aside, and we should just get back to the main topic here. But I do think it's particularly interesting to see how people are responding to a digital card game in which they just get all the cards and can do with whatever they want.
Yeah.
And then this is where I think the guy might get in trouble, is that he has a Patreon.
Right.
Like,
it's
donations.
donations. Yeah. It's the same way that old private servers of World of Warcraft used to function. Not that I've ever used one.
Right, no.
I would never do that.
But you just are aware.
I'm just very aware.
I mean, you should be.
Yes.
It's sort of part of your job.
Right.
To be aware of World of Warcraft and the things that are happening.
Yes. And to never go on a private server for any reasons whatsoever.
Exactly.
But yes, they would always serve off, they'd always function off of donations.
Okay.
And that's how they would always phrase it. Now, if you got rewards for those donations,
that's what's...
Then, great. Okay, you get some perks because you donated. Thank you so much for donating.
I see. Yeah. Okay. So I've been playing a lot of Pixelborn. Yeah. And... exploring the meta of the first set of Lorcana, right? So part of my we played with the theme decks, a week or two ago, something like that.
Yeah, a couple weeks ago. It was like after one of the last podcasts. My
initial impressions were like, look, this game's okay, it's a lot of like Magic light. Plus, basically, it feels like they took Magic and they were like, okay, so we've had 30 years since Magic came out, and here's a bunch of the fixes that other games have, fixes in quotes, that other games have come up with, and we're just going to kind of lump all those in, and then okay, so one of the only things I feel like is a couple things. Mm-hmm. You go from 0 to 20 instead of 20 to 0.
Right.
And which means in order to do that, you don't need to necessarily interact with your opponent.
Right, because the way that you get there is you play a character, and instead of tapping and attacking, you tap and it goes on a quest and you gain lore.
Right. So creatures have creatures. I think they call them characters in Lorcana.
Oh, yeah.
But they have 3 stats now. They have, well, 4 if you count the mana cost. But they have 3 relevant stats when they're in play, which is they have attack, defense, and lore, which is how much they quest for and get you when you quest with them. But basically everything else works pretty similar to Magic in terms of like you play mana that's called ink. You utilize the ink to play the creatures because they have casting costs and spells.
Right. Now, I mean, the whole using cards as mana thing is primarily from Duel Masters. I think that was the first game to do that. That's what everyone references.
I think that would make sense.
Yeah.
You know, and I think looking at Duel Masters as Wizards of the Coast's attempt to sort of like, I don't even know if it was necessarily to fix Magic, but I think
to simplify it for a younger
to bring
audience.
in a younger audience, which I thought was interesting because I found out that Lorcana's target audience is 8 and up, where I think Magic's is 13 and up. So that might be part of what's going on there.
Right.
So we talked a bit last time about the variance that you get from Magic's mana system.
Right.
And how Duel Masters, or any game in particular that has made it so you can use any card as mana, basically...
There's some cards in Lorcana that you can't.
This is my point, is that I think that the designers smartly identified that this... like it's a knob to help you balance cards,
right?
In that you can say, okay, well, either this card can be used as mana or it can't,
right?
And you can't fill your deck with cards that can't be used as mana, but the more powerful stuff can't be turned into mana. And I'm like, okay, so they've brought in a little of that variance back in, which I think is good, rather than just saying any card can be mana,
right?
However, Magic has done a very similar thing, but they approached it from the opposite end, right? Which is, okay, we have mana, cards that can be used as mana, or it can be used as a spell, or it can be used as a, something else, right? They have cards that say, I'm a land first, but I could be this other thing.
Right. It's like where land cycling kind of came from in a way.
Right. And so some of these innovations that I'm talking about, let's sort of wrap that thought up real quick. Is that, okay, so you're going from 0 to 20, which is more interesting in a multiplayer environment.
Which I think they've even admitted that is why they did that.
Right.
Is because it's family friendly. You're going to play with family and friends.
Right.
And so more of the family can play together in a single game.
Right. Okay, so you're going from 0 to 20. You can play almost any card as mana. And also they've eliminated, there's no cross-turn play, right?
Right.
Like there's nothing I can't play anything on my opponent's turn. They can't play anything on my turn. So you need to worry about counter spells.
Just volleys back and forth, like Hearthstone.
I do this thing, pass it back. You do your thing, pass it back. And then creatures, instead of attacking the other player, you can attack other creatures directly if they're tapped. Essentially,
Right.
You don't call it tapped because that's a Magic thing and they can't do that.
Right.
But if a creature has been
exhausted.
Exerted.
Oh, okay.
Yes, they exhaust was already used too, apparently. So
right.
we're gonna run out of terms soon.
When cards are topsy-turvy, that's what's going to be the next one that has to be used.
Yeah, eventually it'll just all be turned sideways.
Turned sideways, yeah. Turn this card sideways.
Turnt.
Card's
been turnt.
Turnt the card.
So
once you turnt it,
you if the card is turnt, then you can attack it, which in turn turns your card.
Right. Yeah.
Great. So so I get on Pixelborn. I'm exploring the meta. I'm looking up sort of what decks are being popularized. There's already been a tournament. There was a 1K tournament.
Wait, money was involved?
$1,000.
Okay.
I don't know if it was all to first place. It probably split amongst the top 4 or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I look at the tournament results. I'm like, okay, just sort of like what's going on. The tournament was in paper too, so people don't have as much access to the cards. Obviously, Pixelborn's like perfect, right? This is the perfect meta. Once everybody gets a hold of all the cards they want, this is what it's going to start looking like. But even when you look at this tournament, the top, 6 of 8 decks was so the colors in Lorcana have particular names. There's Ruby, Emerald, Sapphire, Amber, Amethyst. Is there only 5?
There's 6.
There's 6. Steel. Steel's the last one.
Steel? Is it called
Yeah,
Steel?
it's Steel. Yeah.
Okay.
The top like 6 of 8 decks were all Ruby Amethyst control.
Okay.
Which is a little strange because normally when a meta is first getting established, it's heavy towards aggro. And the reason why is because aggro is a very proactive strategy, and control is usually a very reactive strategy.
Okay.
Which means that it's going to take you, like the meta should establish before a control deck can become dominant, because the control deck has to be finely tuned to beat whatever has been like winning, essentially.
Okay.
Whatever mid-range or aggro deck is dominant, or several decks, you're going to change your list depending upon what is happening, because theoretically you're trying to elongate the game and get to play the most powerful stuff in the game. So when I look at these tournament results, I'm kind of like, okay, it's like a little bit of a red flag, just because like you shouldn't be able to jump directly to control yet. The other thing that's a little weird is that the structures of Lorcana, which we talked a little bit about last time, where when you remove that variance from the casting system, you're favoring aggro because you're making the game just more consistent. And more consistency, theoretically, is advantageous to proactive strategies, right? Like a proactive strategy of, okay, I want to win the game as quickly as possible. I want to play something on turn 1, turn 2, and it should be something that costs 1.
When your mana curve is shrunk, right, and less than something that would be like a control or like a ramp deck or something like that, that goes from the full spectrum of the mana costs, then you have more opportunity for variance to be in your favor.
Right. So, and we also talked a little bit last time about how important variance is for the ability for you to sort of stumble and the opponent to be able to notice that's happened and be able to capitalize on it. So I'm playing a lot of Pixelborn, and I'm trying out a bunch of different decks, just things that sound interesting. And the other thing that I've noticed too is that, I do think that the designers probably understood that aggro would be like advantaged, and that they may have overcorrected. Maybe that's what's going on, and that's why control has been so dominant. But the other thing that I noticed is that all of the most interesting stuff that you can do in this first set is in this mid-rangey area, right? Which is, there's like a song. Okay, so songs is another thing. I feel like I'm jumping all over the place.
I know. I feel like we should probably. I don't know if it would benefit to explain the mechanics as we go along.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess we'll just try to explain it as they come up, because I don't think I'm going to be able to cover everything all at once. Yeah. Okay, so songs. It's a way, like they are spells, like there are in Magic, but you can cast them by tapping one of your creatures that has a higher mana cost, like a high enough mana cost equal to the spell. Right. Tapping, exerting, turning your creature.
As an example, you cast a spell. You could play 3 mana cost creature, and then
the next
turn, if you wanted, you could tap that creature to play a song that's 3 mana cost.
Yeah, there are spells that aren't songs, but every song is a spell. So
and it would cost no mana. The cost is tapping that creature, and it's singing it.
Yeah, and again, this is another weird thing where a lot of games have explored ways to circumvent paying mana costs for things, and it almost always ends in disaster. So it was one of the things I identified early as like, okay, this could be something that is very powerful. But there's like I was saying, there's a lot of mid-rangey stuff that's sort of in the initial set, and that's the stuff that I feel like is more interesting. Aggro is aggro, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's just it's an aggressive strategy. You're trying to just beat your opponent as quickly as possible. Yeah,
it felt pretty similar to if you're just playing like any aggro red deck in Magic. Yeah.
And so, and Ruby Amethyst control is very similar to any kind of control strategy that would be in Magic. Like you're looking to play a board wipe, you're looking to draw a lot of cards, you're looking to eventually get to the high end and go over the top of any other strategy that's happening. Like it's very similar to any kind of tap out control in Magic, as they're called. The reason why it's tap out is because you can't play anything on your opponent's turn anyway, so you have to play everything on your turn. You're not worried about leaving mana open to respond to whatever your opponent is doing. Okay. Okay, so there's a lot of interesting stuff in this mid-range zone where like I said, there's this songs deck that is interesting. It uses Ariel, because Ariel can sing at a 5, even though she costs 3.
Okay.
So it's even another way to cheat out these spells.
Right.
And there's also like a Emerald Steel mid-rangey evasive deck, right? So there's evasive creatures, which is essentially their version of flying, in that they can only be attacked by other creatures with evasive. And then there's also creatures in green that have ward, which means they can't be targeted except to be attacked.
Right.
And what's interesting is my initial thought was, okay, that's really powerful, and Magic has already like gone through their sort of iterations on this type of ability. It starts
you
out
thought
as,
ward was powerful?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Magic starts out at Shroud, which means the thing can't be targeted at all.
Right.
Then they move into Hexproof, which means that you can target it, but your opponents can't.
Right.
And now they've moved into Ward. Which is you can target it, but you have to pay extra to target it with any kind of spell or anything. And so to me, I'm like, okay, well, Ward at this point is probably the iteration in the process that makes the most sense, because, okay, well, not being able to target it at all, it seemed like it was just too non-interactive.
Right.
So in Lorcana, because you can directly attack creatures, I don't think it's quite as bad as what it would be in Magic. But that needs to play out a bit. So yeah, the like I said, there's sort of these interesting mid-rangey things that are happening, and Control preys on mid-range decks, right? Mm-hmm. Theoretically, aggro, the holy trinity of TCGs is you have aggro, which beats Control, you have Control that beats mid-range, and you have mid-range that beats aggro. That's a very typical sort of rock, paper, scissors meta. That's like baseline how a meta should look.
Okay.
It should look more complicated than that. But the problem is that when you don't have the variance to sort of let, okay, aggro beat mid-range sometimes, etc., it starts to become very rock, paper, scissors, right? The other thing that I'm noticing about why I think Control is taking over in Lorcana is because these mid-range decks are more interesting. Like, they're doing things that are they're utilizing some Lorcana-specific mechanics in interesting ways. And I think that people want to play them.
Right.
But with this Control deck looming, it becomes very difficult to win games, because if everybody's playing this Control deck, you're going to want to be playing aggro, not fun mid-range strategies.
Right.
So, I don't know. I don't know exactly where I'm left at the end of this. I was playing Pixelborn like...
You were playing a lot.
I was playing a lot.
I think every single night since you started playing, you were messaging me at some point. You were like, "Oh, green's too strong.
Right,
Green's really good."
And then it was
like, what?
Okay, maybe not. Okay, now it's this other color. Now it's this. Now it's that. And I mean, that's when you're going through and looking at, okay, this is how these things have performed in the past. How are they going to perform in this context? Okay, well, this is one thing that you would look for, is like something that might be too powerful. And, it turns out that the sort of fundamentals, I think, of like how each of these decks should play out, in quotes, all of this is in the context of the fact that this game is very similar to Magic, and in the context of a TCG that operates on very similar structures that Magic does. This is how things tend to play out. Hearthstone, Runeterra, Magic, obviously, Lorcana now, Dual Master, you name it. If they're following this kind of formula, this is kind of what ends up happening.
And what would you say the formula is? Or is it primarily tied to the resource system and how it scales turn by turn?
Yeah. And like the reason why I don't bring up Yu-Gi-Oh in that is because it circumvents the resource systems at all, and I don't know anything about what a Yu-Gi-Oh meta looks like because of that.
And Digimon would also be the same thing. That also kind of breaks that a little bit. Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, these sort of underlying structures of, okay, you get a mana at one every turn, theoretically. You have creatures, you have instants and sorceries, or just sorceries, I guess, in some of their cases. Okay, let's roll that back to baseline. You have permanents that stay on the board,
right? And
you have things that have one effect that happens once and then it's gone, right?
Right.
That's the equivalent. So yeah. I don't know, that's a lot, but Lorcana is, okay, so to sort of sum all of this up and where I think the faults are that I do think the designers of Lorcana have done a pretty good job of designing around. With the fact that, and again, because there's some cards that can't be used as ink, they're basically creating, they're effectively creating mana screw in their game, right? Which is good.
Except at the same time, I'm sure they're looking at the percentage of cards that have mana or are allowed to be used as mana versus not mana, and I would assume it's probably the idealized amount of mana that you would want in a starting hand. And maybe it's even aimed not towards that, and that with aggro cards, if they know, these cards would be very strong in an aggro deck, then maybe they go a little lighter on, this can't be used as ink.
This can't be used as ink.
Which I experienced in the first time that I used, like, what I imagine would be probably the heavy aggro deck, meta aggro deck, is one of the first hands I had. I think I ended up only having 2 cards that could be used as ink, and I was like, oh, shoot. Okay.
Yeah.
As opposed to this control deck that I've been just started playing, and like every card I think in my starting hand could be used as ink.
Right. So I will give them credit where it's due in that they did identify this problem, I think, of saying like, okay, well, if you can use any card in your hand as mana, the game becomes way too consistent.
Yeah.
And
aggro will reign supreme.
I think there's other ways to like turn that knob too, because like right now they're just having it on or off, right? It's either can be used as ink or can't be used as ink. Although no, there's a few things that actually circumvent this. There's a couple cards that like ramp you, which means like you play it and then you get an ink somehow from that card.
Right.
There's like a Detective Mickey and a few other things. And Detective Mickey can't be used as ink, but he gives you an ink when he comes into play.
Right.
So that's a little bit of granularity, which is good.
Right.
So what I am observing at this point in time, and I'm going to reserve the right to change my opinion with new information, as everyone
the
should.
game is just coming out. It's going to have a second set, I'm sure, here in the next few months.
Right. Which is surprising. The second set is like 2 months after 3. I guess they're going to release 4 sets a year already. So,
4 sets a year?
Yeah, it's their plan, from what I've heard.
Okay.
So with these underlying structures where they are, what I'm observing and what I am, I guess, sort of concerned about for the game is that it to me feels like it needs to be very tightly designed around, because you can win the game without interacting with your opponent, right? You can just gain lore. There's no I attack you. You have a chance to block before I get to your life total. So if they're not careful, they have to design around the fact that, okay, well, I could just build a deck that just focuses completely on I just get all my own lore, and there's no reason for you to interact with me at all, or me to interact with you at all.
Right.
There's a little pressure there that happens where it's like, okay, well, if you don't interact with me, I'm just going to win the game.
Right.
But quite a few games do play out that way, in that I'm basically not concerned with what my opponent is doing at all. I'm just getting lore, and they're attacking some of my creatures, and I'm just playing more.
I mean, doesn't that kind of depend on the deck archetype that you're playing too, though?
Yeah.
Like, I feel like aggro is definitely that way. But we also discussed how, like, aggro, depending on how you, like, who you're playing against, you may need to sort of adapt and be more of maybe a little aggro mid-rangey, with how you switch, how you're using your creatures. And instead of just going all in on lore, that occasionally you do have to, volley an attack or two.
And an aggro mirror match is, to me, quite a bit more interesting than a control mirror match. So, I don't know, whatever, for whatever that's worth. But, so with the structures where they are, the designers have done a good job of designing around them, but I'm worried that, again, whatever, it's just my concern. But what I mean is, I foresee a world in which design space is limited because there's not enough variance in the game to give you the leeway to make some of these mistakes. Because and this is one thing that I'm concerned about, even at the initial set, right? This first set, in that, okay, well, it's pretty clear to me that they're going for like sort of this traditional, aggro beats control, control beats mid-range, mid-range beats aggro. But if we're already seeing the metagame sort of coalesce around control, theoretically we should have a response that is, okay, aggro is what should now start to win, because this control deck shouldn't be able to handle the pressure that aggro can put on it consistently, as long as the aggro player is playing effectively. They're not overextending into board wipes and whatever. This episode's getting real nerdy, but
We're talking about card games.
No,
so.
I just mean like this is like real in the weeds. Like if you don't understand competitive card games, this might be a tough one. But okay, so if aggro is still losing, even though like it's favored and it's losing in the hands of a skilled pilot against a skilled pilot of a control deck, then I'm sitting here going, okay, well, these structures are designed in such a way and the game is so consistent that you're going to have to be like spot on with your design work each time to make sure that that kind of a metagame gets established. Otherwise, a deck with a very linear strategy is going to be able to put together that linear strategy every game.
Yeah.
And win.
Right.
So, the other thing that I didn't mention is their mulligan rules are different than Magic. So in Magic, these even got changed fairly recently. But in Magic, you draw your opening hand of cards. You can choose if you want to put your entire hand back and draw 7 new cards, and you can put 1 back from that hand, right, on the bottom of your deck. And Lorcana says, okay, you draw your opening hand. You can keep whatever cards you want, and then put the rest back and draw just new cards for that. It's the Hearthstone mulligan.
Right.
And Hearthstone does this with only 5 cards. And Lorcana is doing it with 7 cards.
5 at the most, I think, right? Because if you're going first, you only start with like 4? Or do you start with 5?
Oh, maybe you do start with 4.
Yeah, I think you start with
less.
less.
It's been a minute. But yeah. Okay, so 4 even. And Lorcana, you're starting with 7. Yeah. So whatever strategy... And they're 60-card decks. They're not 40... Hearthstone's 40 cards.
30.
30?
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh. Okay, whatever. It's been a minute. But... Your ability to make sure that you can execute on any given plan is pretty high in terms of like I draw 7 cards. Okay, I have half of my let's say I have a plan that's 1, 2, and 3 drop, right? Or even just a 1 and a 2 drop. One that's really popular right now in aggro is you want a 1 drop that can quest for 2 lore,
right?
And you want Simba, and Simba is a card that can act as a bodyguard. Oh, here we go. Let's talk about more mechanics.
It's basically Taunt from Hearthstone.
Yeah, it's a sort of,
right.
But only if that character it can be attacked. Like it has to be turned in order to be attacked.
Right. If Simba's also turned,
right,
then someone else can turn into Simba.
Exactly.
Or has to turn
right.
into Simba.
It has to. Can't turn into any other cards.
Right.
And so let's say that's the opening strategy that I want for my aggro deck, and then I've put enough redundancy in my deck that whatever else I draw doesn't matter to me that much, right? It's just stuff that I'm going to use to quest for lore.
Right.
So I'm gonna draw my opening hand of cards. Oh, I got a Simba, but I don't have a 1-drop that taps for 2. I'm going to mulligan everything else and keep the Simba, right?
Right.
And then theoretically I get to replace, oh, there it is. There's the 1-drop I want.
And chances are,
right.
You could not, but chances are you're going to run into what you need.
It depends on how many 1-drops that quest for 2 there are in the game.
Right now there's 2.
There's 2 different ones, so you could have 8 in your deck.
Yeah.
Of your 60 cards, you're going to see 7, then you're going to see 6 more. I haven't done the math on it, but
it's pretty likely.
It seems more likely than it would be in Magic, right?
Yeah.
So, you end up in this territory where like I have a very specific plan that I want to execute, and the likelihood of me being able to do that is pretty high. And so when you've designed these decks, to be able to execute these strategies, there's not a lot of wiggle room for over-tuning something because the variance isn't there to like sort of mop up some of those design mistakes, right? So if you're not like designed to like be really spot on here to make sure that this holy trinity works, you're going to end up with one deck that just becomes dominant, and then you end up with a bunch of mirror matches of just that deck. And it's interesting because I do wonder, we've talked a lot about how these underlying structures incentivize an aggressive strategy. And I think that the designers of Lorcana knew this, and they wanted to make sure that control was viable. And I do wonder if by trying to give control that viability, they may have made it slightly too strong, right? Like it's not perfectly finely tuned, like it'll come out in the percentages. Like we need to see a mass amount of games, but at some point we're going to go, okay, well, even against aggro, this control deck wins 51% of the time, which means you should just be playing the control deck.
Right.
So I guess my point at the end of this is variance is very important. And that it's not just Okay. Well, one more thing about the variants before I pass it over to you about Digimon. But I feel like I'm just monologuing this entire episode. But
I mean, you played a lot more Lorcana.
I played a lot. I played a lot. So, wrapping up about Lorcana, I do think that the structures are designed in such a way that I think it will make it tough to not be spot on with designs. And with it being a paper game, it's hard to ban stuff because you know people have you can't. There's no way to patch the cards. You know, there's people have money invested in these physical cards, and you know you can't tweak them like the way Hearthstone can.
Right. You could hope for a rotation, and I mean, a lot of people seem to be. I don't know. I don't even want to say a lot of people seem to be upset with rotations. I think people are actually fine with rotations. You know, even though there's been a lot of pressure with Magic lately, and Commander being a eternal format and stuff, but in Digimon, for instance, like people were desperate to have a rotation. They were like, "Please, like, add this in, add blocks in."
So you had you sort of explored Digimon in this way when it first released, right? Where you and a friend were
yes.
Did you go to a tournament? I don't remember.
I went to a few. Yeah. I went to a few tournaments. I tried a few meta decks. I preferred to play, I guess, what you could consider B meta decks.
Sure.
You know, I don't really like the A grade decks because I feel like they were all kind of boring.
Right. So you were one of the guys that was playing the fun stuff in the mid range in Lorcana and getting destroyed by control
but
decks.
also when I was getting into Digimon, it was like my first time getting back into a card game since I was in middle school.
Right.
And so I wasn't really familiar with the ideas of mid-range and tempo and aggro and like what those meant. I think if I were to go back and play Digimon or play any card game right now competitively, I think I'd have a much better idea as far as what I'm trying to actually capture when I'm creating a deck. And so instead, it was more like, oh, this seems like a fun theme for a deck that I'm doing here. The difference with Digimon, for instance, and we see this with a lot of card games now. I think Pokemon probably kind of goes in this direction, but I'm not as familiar with it. Yu-Gi-Oh! For sure does. Hearthstone, it seems like, is kind of going in this direction, is that the more consistent that a game appears to be in its resource system. And I don't even necessarily know if it's entirely just in its resource system or it's just how the game has grown into a level of consistency through various means. Maybe it's mechanically. Right. Then the designers end up basically creating the meta. And I'm very excited actually for Lorcana because they did not do that. Right off the bat, it is a very open, explorative. Like there's a couple cards, you know. There's Mickey that's like if you have a broom character,
and there's like hinting at like, look, this could be a thing. That's actually funny. There's a Moana card that is like when you play this, when you play her, you kill. Like it names like literally the other card, which is like, you know, it's very thematic, the god that's in Moana. But I'm like,
it's never going to be played.
What is the, like? I know. This is like a sideboard card, but there's no sideboards. Like
I saw that card and it was like, I love the flavor, but this will never see the light of day. Like, I mean, maybe in like a weird draft or something. I don't know.
I mean, it's possible that they just have a very powerful. What's his name? Teka or something?
Takei? I don't remember.
Whatever.
It's been a while.
On the horizon that they're like...
They have one out right now, but I haven't seen it
They're not that good. Yeah, they're fine. But.
And so it's like there's little bits that... And it's okay to have archetypes. It's okay to have, tribal or themed decks. Magic has that and stuff.
Right.
Like, that's fine. And I feel like a lot of the time the decks kind of design themselves in some ways.
Yeah.
Not entirely, but in most cases, a good portion of it is kind of designed by, there's this handful of vampire creatures and Magic, and I'm playing black-white because this is the deck I'm making.
Yep.
So what are the best black-white vampires? Right. And I'm going to mush them together, and how's it turn out?
Oh, it feels like it has a thing that it does.
Yeah. Right. And you don't have to get incredibly creative. Now, you can make changes from there.
And I do think that's a pretty good idea in terms of, like, introducing somebody to deck building.
Oh, yeah.
Like, that's great, but, like, that shouldn't be all your game is doing.
Right. And I think that Lorcana kind of dabbling in that a little bit at the moment. They have some Elsa Anna stuff going on. Like, I think that stuff is fine. And it's not incredibly powerful, and it's just sort of hints at what's possible in the future. And I think that's neat.
Yep.
But
Agreed.
you look at like Yu-Gi-Oh! And Yu-Gi-Oh! Is the complete opposite. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is we have locked all of the most powerful cards behind particular archetypes.
Yep.
So if you want to have the most powerful draw spell card, for instance, now this is not, I'm generalizing a ton here, so and I don't play a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh! So forgive me for my ignorance. But as far as I could tell, Pot of Greed, incredibly broken.
Oh, yeah.
And for those that don't know, in Yu-Gi-Oh! You can play infinite spells and traps.
Right.
Per turn.
There's no mana cost in Yu-Gi-Oh!
There's no mana cost. There's limits to how many creatures you can summon, in a way.
In a way.
In a way. But spells
Yu-Gi-Oh! No limits.
Basically. Spells and traps, unlimited. You can play as many as you want per turn.
Okay.
So that's how it came out and was released. And they immediately came out with Pot of Greed, which is, infamous and draws 2 cards.
Right.
So anyone that's played a competitive card game,
okay, so you can have 4 copies of card in your deck, or what? What's the limit?
I think you could have 3 or 4.
3 or 4, and then is it 40 card decks or is it 60?
40 card decks.
40 card decks.
Yes.
Somewhere around 3 or 4 copies of your. Yeah, that's insane. That's
insane.
That's a huge
and not only that,
chance.
that was only one of the card draw cards. There was Jar of Greed, which was a trap card that let you draw 1 card, so not quite as good, and you had to wait a turn to activate. It replaced itself.
Right.
And then you had Graceful Charity, which I think was you draw 3 and discard 2, I think, something like that.
Right.
And then I think there was another card that literally you like discard your whole hand and then draw like 7 cards or something. You and your opponent, I think.
Oh, okay, sure.
But there's all this draw power that costs nothing, and you can play forever and chain into itself.
Right.
And so it got too powerful. So eventually when they decided, okay, we're going to try and get this meta figured out in this game. This game is insane. The same exact major deck, which was Chaos, the Chaos Control meta, I think, lasted for literal years because they didn't have
no rotation.
They didn't have a rotation, and even banning them and limiting them, it was such a consistent game because of, I think, a lot of the draw power and the fact that there weren't those limits to that. That even if they limited it to like you can only have one of this one card that everyone's playing, it was still better than anything else.
Oh my gosh!
So
it's the Queen problem in action.
They had an interesting solution to the Queen problem, and. Should we get into the Queen problem?
Well, we talked about it last time a little bit, but we can reiterate.
So the Queen problem is from, I guess it's coined term. I think Richard Garfield or Mark Rosewater coined it.
I mean, those are the 2 guys that have done everything. I think.
So
we'll just say it's one of them, even if it's not
one of them.
It's like Gandhi or Einstein. You just attribute quotes to them, and people are like, "Oh yeah, that's a smart thing."
Okay, so this was a quote by Walt Disney, and he talked about the Queen problem.
Yeah, exactly.
And how the Queen problem, when you are creating a game that is a draftable card game or a out of game meta construction that you're compiling things, using chess as an example, you're to get all the chess pieces and draft them. Everyone's just going to pick a bunch of queens.
Yeah.
And so you need a system, usually some sort of a resource or limitation system, in order to make sure that you cannot just have nothing but queens.
Right.
And so that's where mana costs and whatnot come in.
Yep.
Now, if you can play infinite spells and traps, and there's no limitation to that whatsoever, what's the queen? And you're only going to put the queens.
You're going to play all queens.
It's going to be Raigeki, so it's nothing but board wipes. It's nothing but draw power. It's all the strongest versions of them. It's amazing. So, what Yu-Gi-Oh! Eventually did is they decided that, okay, you can draw 2 cards with a spell card, but you have to have a Blue Eyes on the field first. And then everyone was like, well, okay, that's still really good, strong draw power.
That is a way to solve it, I suppose.
So
it's very binary.
It's very binary. But all of their archetypes generally have some sort of spell like that. So every archetype kind of has its draw spell, its search spell, etc. But it is locked behind you have to have this particular creature like on the field or in your hand, or there's something there.
Right.
I'm very happy to see Lorcana not go in that direction.
Sure. It's interesting, though, because, like, that is original. That is a different way to try to solve this problem. Right. And I do think that a lot of games have sort of defaulted to Magic's version of solving the queen problem,
right?
Which Lorcana does,
right?
But there's some variation there. But I'm curious about the way that the meta has evolved so far in Lorcana. If we're going to continue to see, hopefully we'll continue to see evolution. There's a new set around the corner.
Yeah.
I do think it's a little. In terms of like erring on one side or the other, it is interesting that I think Lorcana erred on the side of control, where it's not particularly fun to play for most people to play against a control deck.
Right.
That's kind of like the fun police deck, right? And to sort of like err on the side of, well, we need to make sure control is powerful enough here so that it's an archetype that can be played.
Mm-hmm.
I think in some ways maybe it was them saying, hey, we want Magic fans to see that we're a serious card game, therefore control, is
That's
a
possible.
serious archetype.
Yeah, they knew that their demographic was going to get it based off of the marketing and based off of a lot of the gameplay that they chose. And so, maybe you're right in that they decided the meta they were going to shoot for was going to be the very heady, brainy meta.
Potentially. I think that conflicts a little bit with their target audience being 8 and up, but maybe they're seeing it as, okay, most people sitting around a dinner table aren't going to play this control deck.
Right. Yeah.
So we'll see also how they decide to support organized play. I know that they've tried to really, go to game stores first and get, Lorcana on the store shelves, which has been kind of a disaster, to be honest.
Has it? I don't know.
Oh,
I mean, it's been terrible at our local game store.
Yeah,
I think they ordered 100 boxes and got like 3 or 5 or something.
The allocations have been really bad, and then they also ran up against their release date for like Walmart and stuff, like being in actual big box stores, and
which is probably where they primarily want it.
No, I think they actually did legitimately want it in game stores.
Oh, I'm sure they wanted it in both, but I would feel like you'd probably prioritize. Yeah. I feel like that's where the families are going to see it and the kids are going to see it.
Right,
and,
your target audience is probably at Walmart and probably definitely at a game store too. But
I mean, think about
you're going to get people that have never played card games interested.
Right, you're going to go to a Target and they have a whole Disney section now, and now imagine just a little Lorcana spot right there.
Well, even they're selling it at Downtown Disney,
which we talked about that.
That's
I think
crazy.
That I hope that they support that, because that to me is the coolest concept. Yeah. Like being a kid and getting to go and to Disneyland, first of all, which is already great, and then you show up and there's a card game and there's other kids that are learning the card game and you're playing together.
Yeah, that's pretty.
And
awesome.
like that's so cool. That's so cool.
When my mom took me to Hawaii when I was a kid, and the my fondest memory is buying Japanese Pokemon cards.
Oh yeah,
because they had like packs from Japan and stuff there, and it was like totally was like that. I'm like, oh, I'm buying these, and I'm like, there's got to be kids doing the same thing now with Lorcana, right? Like, which is super cool.
I wish I could still have that naivety and enthusiasm for card games, and that like I feel like now a card game comes out and I'm like, all right, what's TCG player got? Like, all right, what's the price? Huh? How much?
The meta? What am I buying? Yeah, I mean, you kind of have to be, unfortunately, with how expensive this stuff has gotten. But, we'll see. I mean, the power of like the Disney IP is extreme. Also, the art in the game looks phenomenal.
Yeah,
like,
the art direction is so
good.
The art direction is probably the most solid art direction of like an initial launch of a game.
Yeah, I don't
of a card game.
I don't know if there's any card that really is like a strikeout.
There's a
couple. Few. I wouldn't name them.
Well, it's not even a quality thing to me. It's like there's a couple cards that I'm like, okay, this doesn't fit within the standard color scheme that all the other cards exist
like
in.
The color of
and it's like that could have just been like, okay,
it could have been a playtesting change. Like they switched a card over or something. Yeah, who knows?
Yeah, but the fact that there's only a couple is kind of insane.
That's pretty great.
Yeah. And we've talked about this, which is kind of interesting because we're both artists.
Yeah.
But that separation of working on different IPs in this way, that like, I don't know, the idea of having this one game that has such a solid level of art direction, as opposed to a lot of other releases that come out that it's a little bit more freeform,
Sure.
kind of, and they let the artist sort of decide.
Right.
And that, like, I would liken this game closer to something like Hearthstone, I suppose.
Yeah. No,
And Hearthstone
definitely.
has very, very solid art direction. They're very specific. It's not a lot of feedback, but they're very particular with who they hire.
Right.
I think
to make sure that they're going to hit the style.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, when you've got Disney sort of breathing down your neck, I'm sure they got to nail the.
Yeah, I'm sure there's quite a few people that they have to get approval from.
Very concerned about being, on spec. What's the term
On
style?
On style, yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
I
Get
don't
the
know.
style right.
I've had to draw Mickey. I don't know. And
Really?
Yeah,
For what?
for a mobile game for
Oh.
like 3-year-olds.
Oh wow.
And it was the most I've ever been art directed.
Yeah.
Was Mickey's hand.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
I got, I think, feedback 3 times.
That makes sense.
Does
His hands are very important.
They apparently they are. Apparently they are. Yeah.
Yeah. No. Yeah. We'll see. I don't know. Lorcana will be interesting to watch.
Mm-hmm.
The design space, like we're
I
talking.
feel like you seem concerned about the design space, but I don't. I do see the concerns with a level of consistency,
Right.
like you're saying.
Yeah.
But as far as the space with I don't know the mechanical design space.
Oh, yeah, that's all fine. That's not really what I mean. I guess maybe design space isn't even the right word to use here. It feels like you're limiting your ability to experiment, which is what I mean by limiting your design space.
Mm-hmm.
In that, like, okay, well, we're not quite sure. Like, we've done our internal play testing, but it's going to look different when it hits mass market.
Yeah.
But if we get this wrong, players are going to be able to consistently pull off whatever this thing that's wrong is. Right.
I mean, that's
The
definitely a
variance-
concern.
Yeah, the variance isn't giving you that leeway.
I also think we live in a weird time in that the spreading of information is so massive.
It's rapid.
That
it's very strange.
I do think. I mean, it means designers should probably be more concerned about it, but also, I mean, I think every TCG. I mean, I can't speak for Magic. I don't know Magic's initial metas. When it was in tournaments, I do know that because it was the first card game, people just had no idea what they were doing.
To do. Yeah, yeah. Now
and it
it's
wasn't
like
until like what I guess Channel Fireball was like the first big.
Yeah,
that was like a big thing
that's
that
the most-
ended up causing a lot of shifting.
the most famous,
Right.
Black Lotus Channel Firewall. Yeah,
Right. But
Yeah.
other than that, I mean, Pokemon came out, terrible initial meta. Awful. Yu-Gi-Oh came out, terrible initial meta. Awful. And like it was all the same. And eventually they had workarounds. And usually they were mechanical workarounds because they had to be. You can't change most card games don't change the entire structural rules of the game after it's been released.
Right.
You usually can't get away with it without breaking the game.
Right.
And so, but I do think that, I mean, if a game like this, for instance, comes out and is already looking like, oh, there's, control, it's definitely leaning more towards control, but there's a lot of experimentation still going on. There's a lot of exploration. The fact that it's still, it hasn't been really locked down.
Well,
As like, well, if you're saying 6 out of the 8 decks,
it looks pretty locked down. I don't know.
then
We'll
that's
see.
not great.
Yeah.
But I'd still say like that's probably okay for initial release of a game. Like that's pretty okay.
Yeah, I mean they and again, these other decks, they're competitive still. It's just that they're just not theoretically going to be consistent enough. We'll see what happens, but there's a lot of different interesting decks to play. The set's about 200 cards, and it is fascinating that they were able. Like there is a lot of different decks that are like able to be created here, and they've to me they've done a very good job with designing the cards as Lego pieces that are able to be used in multiple different ways, right?
Yeah.
Rather than this is a windshield, that's all it's used for, right?
Yeah.
But okay, so another potential pitfall here that I would also be concerned about is the game having a low amount of variance, making it harder for designers to have that leeway to make mistakes. And when an audience experiences different levels of variance, when they initially encounter the game, whatever it is, they're going to be. That's the time when they're going to be willing to accept the most variance.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, it's very difficult to add variance back into your game and keep your player base happy.
Right.
Because they're like, well, why is this not working?
Yeah.
It's supposed to just work. I don't understand.
Right.
And so starting off, I mean, for me, I think I may have tried to lean a little bit more into variance, especially early on, just because you can't get any of that ground back. Like from here, it only gets more consistent.
Yeah.
So we'll see. It's not impossible, and especially if they're doing rotations and things, maybe that's. I don't think they've said anything about that yet, but we'll see.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
There's things that you can do that with the way that the lore system works. That you can technically win the game without interacting with your opponent. That's
right.
A little strange. We'll see how much that matters. It might be that, okay, my opponent's interacting with me and I just don't care, but there's still interaction. There's a pressure that happens there that says you have to interact with me or I'm just going to win.
Right.
So,
which is good. I'm glad that there's at least some of that. I think that was our initial concern. That was our initial testing was seeing okay, how our initial thoughts were, I think we fell on purple, yellow, or amethyst.
And that was literally just looking
amber.
at first layer, did they account for the fact that these proactive strategies are going to be advantaged in that we're going to find the best aggro cards, put those in the same deck. It happens to be amber amethyst because they have, that's where the 2/1 drops that tap for 2 lore are. Yeah. So we throw that in a deck together, see how it goes. And it at first was insane.
I mean, I don't think I think maybe I lost one game with you. And even then, I think it was a mid-range.
Which would have been the best thing that prepared to beat an aggro deck. Yeah. Yep. So, we'll see. The other thing that's a little weird is you're already starting to see the control mirror matches kind of degrade into what ends up happening, which is when the meta becomes all about a control strategy. Control decks are designed to go long game, right? Yeah. The matches end up really long. Sometimes when I'm playing in a Magic tournament, I'm playing control and my opponent's playing control. We might only be able to play one game instead of best 2 out of 3 because the game lasts the whole time limit of the round.
Yeah.
And so when I'm playing on Lorcana and I'm playing a control mirror, it ends up in that same territory in that the person who ends up you start having to worry about how many cards you have left in your deck because the fail safe on a card game is okay. You run out of cards, game's over. Right. If that's not there, the game could just last forever.
Right.
However, we have another little bit of a problem with what they've decided to put into the initial set.
Okay.
This is getting very specific, by the way, but there's a broom card, which is one of Mickey's brooms. That when you play it, you get to shuffle a card from your discard pile back into your deck.
Right.
Right. And so if you have 2 of these broom cards, you can loop them and never draw out of your deck.
Right.
Which means you can now circumvent the emergency release valve, which is you're going to run out of deck.
That seems pretty specific.
No, this is what I'm saying, though, is that this is the kind of stuff you have to think about because this is where the meta game is going to end up, is that you're going to have control mirror matches. I shouldn't say definitely going to end up, but very much in danger of ending up, is that you're going to have control mirror matches where the person who wins is the one who has cards left in their deck. And you've created a way for them to keep cards in their deck. So what happens when both players can just do this forever? There is a potential possibility for a stalemate in the game is kind of what I'm saying.
There isn't, though, because eventually you're going to play things and one person gets to go for lore.
Right.
Before the other person
Right.
does. So no matter what, there will eventually be someone that gets out ahead.
Well, that's what I mean, though. There's a possibility in the infinite possibilities of the games that can be played where I am I'm making I keep playing brooms, right, to loop stuff. Let's say I have 3 brooms so that I can get another. Can I even get another card in there? Okay, as long as there isn't a way that I can play a broom to shuffle in a card, and then play another broom to shuffle in a broom, and then. That way, I keep looping like a removal spell, right? So that if you can create that loop, which I think you probably can, then you can't. There's no if you're both doing that, then no one wins the game. Now, in a tournament setting, you would go to time. So at least there's that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. That to me is interesting. And it brings up a question for me is that should a game be designed in a way that has a definite end point, right? There's a thrust that's happening that says, okay, the game, like Marvel Snap, right? The game ends in six turns.
Yeah.
And that's it. You just get 6 turns.
Yeah.
That's all. Which I think is interesting.
Yeah.
It's one of the more interesting things about Marvel Snap to me, which we can talk about Marvel Snap at a different time.
I was just watching a bunch of Marvel Snap gameplay today. So.
In more detail. We'll go into more detail later. But I do wonder if that, in a if we're going to start modernizing these TCGs, maybe that's something that needs to be looked at, is there's a definite endpoint.
I mean, I think that's definitely one thing that could be looked at. I think if there is anyone to be, a little bit more bold and break out of the mold would just be, did I rhyme? I didn't mean to rhyme there.
Maybe.
Bold and break out of the mold.
Yeah, that's good.
Shit.
Keep going.
It's getting old. All right. If anyone was,
I've been told.
If anyone's gonna try and be like a little more innovative, I really think that people can start looking at game states that aren't progressed by a consistently growing resource each turn.
Yeah.
And I still always go back to Yu-Gi-Oh! As much as I just kind of talked about Yu-Gi-Oh!'s meta and how, I'm not a personal fan of how they kind of design the meta each set. The fact is that it's an incredibly unique system for a card game.
Yeah.
And I think the whole reason that you even have a growing resource system in a game is how it changes the game state and how it makes the game feel. Is that over time you can get to these...
There's a progression, yeah.
There's a progression within it. And then there's this sort of big finale, in fireworks usually, with like, oh, I'm going to play my big spell or whatever, and then it ends.
Yeah, this is part of like the gameplay narrative that I discuss a lot. Yeah,
right.
But...
And I think that that's great, but it's not the only way of doing things.
Sure.
I think, another example is Flesh and Blood doesn't do that, actually. Flesh and Blood has, another sort of hand card resource system that's a little bit more back and forth.
And it's telling kind of a different kind of story.
Right, and in fact,
it
tells a degrade of a story, and that over time your armor is weakened and your body is weakened, and eventually I don't know. I haven't played enough Flesh and Blood, but from what I've gathered is that over time you may actually become less efficient if you have less armor or weapons or items, etc.
So you're basically like you have permanents, and then over time those permanents are going away rather than you're adding to them.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting.
And I don't know. I just think that there's definitely a lot more space for card games to explore that avenue. I think also how games end is another way.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone has pretty much always treated card games in a very 1v1 setting, which is good. I mean, a lot of them plan on it being 1v1, but even Lorcana having it count up to 20, like that is something that is going to be beneficial for multiplayer games.
Yeah, it tries to future-proof a little bit.
Yeah. I don't think it will completely solve it, and there's lots of other reasons for that. Politics and king making is a big one, but but other than that, it's helpful, I should say. And so I don't know. I feel like there's definitely a lot more space for innovation in the trading card game genre, but we're also kind of reaching this new renaissance. Of card games. Lots and lots and lots of indie card games and new card games are coming out. We're starting to see the re-rise of every anime IP ever is getting a card game.
TCG players, we're eating good. Let's get it.
Back in that early 2000s era of, every show now has a card game. Which is, there is a lot of cool stuff. I showed you the Zatch Bell card game and how... It's the one that there's like a spell book or whatever.
Crazy.
That's kind of cool. I like that idea.
I can't wait to see more innovation like this.
Yeah, I want to see more stuff like that.
Lorcana looks promising, looks solid from its foundations, not doing a lot of innovation.
Right.
It's sort of taking the safe path a bit, which makes sense. It's Disney. It has a really big IP behind it. They're not going to let you do some kind of crazy stuff.
Right. We'll see. The majority of the system has been proven to work already. And so
stood the test of time at this point, 30 years. So
yeah.